the Once and Future Present episode 27, The Age of Isms, Ideologies and Revolutions in the Early 19th Century, an AP European History podcast by Hammer History Productions. Welcome back to the Once and Future Present. Today we're diving into a century that seemed like it couldn't make up its mind. Revolution or repression? Liberty or order? And all the new isms, liberalism, nationalism, socialism, conservatism, we're just getting started. With me as always is Dr. Morgan, and joining us too is Professor Theo. Welcome back to both of you.
Thanks, Casey. I'm looking forward to unpacking how these ideas shaped people's lives, not just in politics, but in culture and society too.
Dr. Morgan, can you give us a sense of what's happening in Europe after Napoleon?
Absolutely, Casey. After Napoleon's defeat in 1815, European leaders gathered at the Congress of Vienna to try and put Europe back together again, on their terms. The idea was to restore the old monarchies, redraw the map, and prevent future revolutions. But that stability didn't last long, because the ideas unleashed by the French Revolution, liberty, equality, and nationalism, had already taken root.
But why? Don't we value those ideas now?
We do now, Casey, but back then, monarchs saw those ideas as dangerous. They associated liberty and equality with the chaos of the French Revolution, mob violence, regicide, and war. Conservatism after 1815 wasn't just about keeping power. It was about preventing that kind of instability from returning. They believed order, tradition, and hierarchy were necessary for peace.
One of the early voices of modern conservatism was Edmund Burke. He had actually supported the American Revolution, but was horrified by the French Revolution. He believed rapid political change led to chaos and violence. Instead, he argued that societies should evolve slowly, respecting traditions and inherited wisdom. His ideas deeply influenced conservative leaders across Europe, especially in the way they feared abstract theories and revolutionary upheaval.
So who exactly was at the Congress, and what did they decide?
Great question. The Congress was led by the so-called Great Powers: Austria, Prussia, Russia, Great Britain, and somewhat surprisingly, France. They were represented by influential diplomats like Metternich of Austria and Talleyrand of France. Their goal was to restore what they called the balance of power.
And what does that mean exactly?
The balance of power was the idea that no single country should be strong enough to dominate Europe like Napoleon had. To make that happen, they redrew the political map. Russia was given most of Poland, while Prussia gained parts of Saxony and the Rhineland. Austria received northern Italy, and the Netherlands was merged with Belgium to create a buffer against France.
It's important to note that they weren't redrawing borders based on what local people wanted. Nationalism was ignored in favor of dynastic claims and strategic interests.
Metternich, in particular, was deeply opposed to nationalism as an ideology. He believed it was a direct threat to the stability of the Austrian Empire, which included many different ethnic and linguistic groups: Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Slovaks, Italians, Croats, and more. If each group demanded its own nation-state, the empire would fragment. So for Metternich, suppressing nationalism wasn't just conservative, it was a matter of political survival.
So this wasn't just about punishing France?
Surprisingly, no. France was treated relatively leniently. They restored the Bourbon monarchy under Louis XVIII and required reparations, but they weren't dismembered. The other powers wanted France to remain stable so it wouldn't fall into revolutionary chaos again.
And to enforce all these decisions and keep peace, they formed what was called the Concert of Europe. It was sort of a club of monarchs who agreed to consult and even intervene to maintain the conservative order.
Exactly. It was backed by the Quadruple Alliance: Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia. They pledged to uphold the Vienna settlement and suppress revolutions wherever they appeared. This was more than diplomacy. It was an international system designed to block change.
Did it work?
Yes and no. The cracks were already forming. In 1820, liberal army officers in Spain rebelled against King Ferdinand VII and forced him to accept a constitution, temporarily. The revolt was crushed when France, under the banner of the Concert of Europe, sent troops to restore absolutist rule.
That same year, revolts also erupted in parts of Italy, especially in the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies and Piedmont. These uprisings aimed for constitutional monarchies and liberal reform. Austria, as part of the alliance, intervened and crushed those movements quickly.
And across the Atlantic, revolutions were unfolding too. Latin American independence movements, led by figures like Simón Bolívar and José de San Martín, were breaking away from Spanish control. The monarchs of Europe viewed this as part of the same revolutionary wave, even if they couldn't stop it directly.
And closer to home, another major nationalist movement was unfolding in southeastern Europe. The Greek War of Independence began in 1821, when Greeks rose up against centuries of Ottoman rule. Inspired by both nationalism and romantic ideals, they declared independence and fought a long, brutal struggle.
What made Greece's revolution different was the amount of support it received from Western Europe. Many Europeans saw ancient Greece as the cradle of Western civilization. Artists and intellectuals romanticized the cause, and even volunteers, like the poet Lord Byron, joined the fight. This wave of Philhellenism helped turn public opinion.
Eventually, Britain, France, and Russia intervened militarily in support of the Greeks, and by 1830, Greece was officially recognized as an independent kingdom. It was a rare example of a successful nationalist revolution during a time when most others were being crushed.
So by the 1830s, the so-called conservative peace was already under pressure, from the inside and the outside. And while the Concert of Europe had been successful in suppressing some early revolts, they couldn't prevent revolutionary ideas from spreading.
If revolutionary ideas were spreading, how did nationalism start to grow if the borders were drawn to ignore it?
That's where culture becomes really important. National identity was actually a pretty new idea for many people. In the early 1800s, most people identified more with their region or town than with a larger country. Even language wasn't standardized. Peasants in southern Italy and northern Italy often couldn't understand each other. In France, regional dialects like Breton or Occitan were more common than standard French in many areas. So this romantic nationalism was as much about creating a national culture as it was about defending one. The Romantic movement helped fuel this cultural nationalism. Think of people like the brothers Grimm in Germany collecting folk tales, or scholars in Hungary and Bohemia preserving their native languages and songs. These stories helped people imagine themselves as part of a larger national we.
And in Italy, Giuseppe Mazzini took it even further. He wasn't just interested in language or poetry, he wanted full national independence. He founded a movement called Young Italy, which called for a democratic, united Italian republic. Mazzini saw nationalism as a moral force that would liberate people and build a better society.
So, Romanticism and nationalism were kind of feeding each other?
Absolutely. Romanticism valued emotion, nature, and the deep soul of a people, what they called Volksgeist in Germany. That idea of a shared spirit helped justify demands for national self-rule. Writers, artists, and composers like Chopin or Verdi were creating works that celebrated their cultural identities and that had real political implications.
But not all nationalism was progressive. In some places, it turned exclusive, emphasizing who belonged to the nation and who didn't. That could lead to tension and even violence, especially in multi-ethnic empires like Austria.
So nationalism could be about pride and freedom, but also about exclusion?
Exactly. It had liberating potential, but also dangerous consequences. And that dual nature of nationalism would shape Europe for the rest of the century and beyond.
You mentioned liberalism earlier. What were the central ideas to that?
Early liberals emphasized individual rights, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and constitutional government. They believed that people should be governed by laws made by elected representatives, not by absolute monarchs. In many cases, liberals were middle-class professionals, lawyers, journalists, bankers, and professors.
And they weren't pushing for democracy in the modern sense. Most liberals supported voting rights, but only for property-owning men. They saw political participation as something that had to be earned through education and social status. It was a philosophy of progress, but also of limits.
Philosophers like John Stuart Mill in Britain and Benjamin Constant in France helped shape liberal ideas about liberty, responsibility, and the role of government. Their arguments laid the foundation for modern political thought, even as conservatives worked to keep those ideas in check. Early liberals also strongly embraced the economic ideas of Adam Smith. Liberals believed that free markets, guided by competition and individual initiative, would lead to prosperity and progress. They supported limited government interference in the economy, what we now call laissez-faire policies. This alignment with capitalism reinforced their commitment to property rights and shaped how they approached issues like taxation, trade, and labor laws.
Did those ideas ever spark actual change before 1848?
Definitely. One of the clearest examples was in Britain with the repeal of the Corn Laws in 1846. These were tariffs on imported grain designed to keep food prices high to benefit domestic landowners.
But the downside was that high food prices hurt the urban poor, especially in times of scarcity. And that's exactly what happened during the Irish potato famine, which began in 1845. A fungus devastated the potato crop, the staple food for much of Ireland, and millions faced starvation. Yet food exports from Ireland continued, and prices remained high because of the Corn Laws.
The crisis sparked massive protests, and liberal reformers like Richard Cobden and John Bright argued that free trade and lower food prices were a moral necessity. Prime Minister Robert Peel ultimately pushed through the repeal, even though it split his own Conservative Party.
It was a major moment for liberal economics. The repeal of the Corn Laws showed how liberal ideas about markets and government intervention were playing out in real time, with real consequences for people's lives.
Meanwhile, in France, July Revolution of 1830 was also motivated by liberal ideas. That uprising removed the conservative Bourbon king, Charles X, and replaced him with the more liberal Louis Philippe, the so-called citizen king. It was a revolt driven by the urban middle class who wanted a constitutional monarchy and greater civil liberties.
But even that revolution had limits. Louis Philippe didn't extend voting rights much further, and many working-class Parisians felt left out. Still, the July Revolution sent a signal across Europe that liberal and nationalist ideas could challenge old regimes. It helped inspire revolts in Belgium, Italy, and Poland.
In Belgium, for example, the revolution succeeded. Belgium gained independence from the Netherlands and established a liberal constitutional monarchy. But in Italy and Poland, uprisings were crushed by Austrian and Russian forces. So you can see the pattern. Liberalism was spreading, but reactionary regimes still held most of the power.
Let's circle back to another big ism, socialism. We talked about early cultural nationalism, but how did socialism grow during this period?
Socialism arose out of the devastating effects of industrialization. As factories grew and urban poverty worsened, more people began to question whether free market capitalism was fair or sustainable. Many saw it enriching a few while exploiting the masses. Working hours were brutal, wages were low, and housing was overcrowded. That led to calls for a new economic system based on cooperation instead of competition.
Some of the early socialists, called utopian socialists, imagined ideal communities where property was shared and work was done for the common good. Charles Fourier wanted people to live in self-sustaining communities he called phalanxes. Henri de Saint-Simon envisioned a society led by scientists and engineers who would plan the economy to benefit everyone.
Robert Owen, who we mentioned earlier, was especially practical. He tried to create a model factory town at New Lanark in Scotland, with shorter work hours, child education, and improved housing. He even attempted to build a utopian community in Indiana called New Harmony.
Did any of these communities work?
Some had initial success, but didn't last. They struggled with funding, leadership disputes, and resistance from surrounding capitalist societies. But their ideas had lasting influence. And it's worth noting, Unlike conservatism or liberalism, socialism was harder to pin down as a single ideology. Each socialist thinker had a different vision of what an ideal society looked like. Some emphasized spiritual harmony, others focused on economic planning, and still others looked to communal living or scientific management. What united them was a desire to rethink ownership, labor, and the relationship between individuals and the broader society, but their solutions often diverged dramatically.
And then in 1848, the same year as the revolutions, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels published the Communist Manifesto. That was a game changer. Marx argued that all of history was a struggle between classes, those who owned the means of production and those who did not. Marx argued that the driving force of history was class conflict between the haves and the have-nots. In feudal society, it had been lords and serfs. Under capitalism, it was the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. Marx believed that true liberation would only come when the working class collectively owned the means of production, factories, land, tools, rather than leaving them in private hands.
What did they want people to do?
They called on the working class, the proletariat, to unite and overthrow the bourgeoisie, or capitalist class. Marx believed that capitalism would eventually collapse under its own contradictions and be replaced by a classless communist society summed up by his principle, from each according to his ability to each according to his needs, which envisioned a society where cooperation replaced competition and economic inequality was abolished.
The Communist Manifesto was short, but it packed a punch. Its famous opening line, "A specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism," really captured the spirit of the age. And though it didn't spark a revolution right away, it became one of the most influential political texts in modern history.
So socialism started as these imaginative communities, but then became more radical and revolutionary?
Exactly. Marx and Engels moved socialism away from utopian dreams and toward a scientific, historical theory of change. They saw revolution not as a fantasy, but as inevitable.
And even people who didn't agree with Marx were affected by his ideas. His critique of capitalism would shape debates for the next 150 years.
And all of this was happening right before the revolutions of 1848, right?
Exactly. It was like all these ideological tensions, liberal, socialist, and nationalist, boiled over at once. The revolutions of 1848 started in France, but the energy quickly spread across the continent.
So what kicked things off in France?
France had a long-standing tension between the monarchy and reformers. In February 1848, economic hardship and demands for expanded suffrage led to mass protests in Paris. King Louis Philippe abdicated, and the Second Republic was proclaimed. For a moment, it seemed like a victory for both liberalism and socialism.
And remember Louis Blanc, the socialist who advocated for government-guaranteed jobs? He convinced the new government to create national workshops to provide employment.
But they got shut down, right?
Yes, the national workshops were expensive, and many in the government saw them as hotbeds of radicalism. When they were closed in June, the working class rose up in what became known as the June Days. It was a bloody revolt, and the government crushed it with overwhelming force.
That moment was crucial. It showed how quickly the alliance between the working class and the middle class could fall apart. The middle class prioritized stability, property, and order over social reform.
After the revolt, the Second Republic drifted to the right. In December 1848, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, Napoleon's nephew, was elected president. He promised law and order, and in 1852, he declared himself Emperor Napoleon III.
So much for a republic.
And France was just the beginning. The 1848 revolutions exploded across Central Europe too.
In the Austrian Empire, Hungarian nationalists led by Lajos Kossuth demanded autonomy. They called for a separate legislature and constitution. At first, Emperor Ferdinand granted some concessions, but he later fled Vienna. Protesters had even stormed the imperial palace.
Students and workers in Vienna formed revolutionary committees. In Prague, Czechs demanded recognition of their national identity. The Habsburg Empire was unraveling fast.
But then the empire pushed back. The new emperor, Franz Joseph, came to power and with help from Russian troops, reconquered Hungary. In Prague, the uprising was crushed by Austrian artillery. Reformers were arrested, and the empire reasserted itself by brute force.
So all those national movements just failed?
Temporarily, yes, but the memory of those uprisings never went away. They set the stage for future nationalist campaigns.
Meanwhile, in the German Confederation, revolutionaries gathered at the Frankfurt Assembly to draft a constitution for a united Germany. There was serious debate. Should Germany include Austria or be led by Prussia alone? They eventually offered the crown to King Frederick William IV of Prussia.
And he said no?
He did. He refused to take a crown from the gutter, meaning he wouldn't accept legitimacy from a group of elected delegates. Without his support, the assembly collapsed.
In Italy, it was a similar story. Revolts broke out in the north against Austrian control. Rome even declared a republic, led by Mazzini. But Pope Pius IX fled, and French troops invaded to restore papal authority. The dream of Italian unification had to wait.
In every case, revolutions sparked real hope, but fell apart due to internal divisions and external repression. Liberals and radicals couldn't always agree on goals, and monarchies were willing to use overwhelming force to crush dissent.
That must have been disillusioning.
It was, but it also planted seeds for the future. Many of the people who experienced 1848 would go on to shape the unifications of Italy and Germany and redefine European politics.
The revolutions failed in the short term, but they proved that nationalism, liberalism, and socialism weren't fringe ideas. They were forces that couldn't be ignored.
So even when revolutions are crushed, the ideas behind them can survive?
Exactly. History is full of second chances. And we shouldn't forget the role of women in the revolutions of 1848. While they're often left out of the big political narratives, women were active participants, as writers, organizers, and fighters.
Really? What kinds of things were they doing?
In France, women like Jeanne de Rouen and Pauline Roland wrote pamphlets, gave speeches, and founded political clubs. Some called for the right to vote, the right to work, and legal equality. Women took part in demonstrations and helped organize relief for wounded protesters.
In Vienna, women formed revolutionary committees and even stood guard at the barricades. In Berlin and Budapest, they marched in protests and distributed underground newspapers. And in Italy, Cristina Trivulzio di Belgiojoso helped fund and organize revolutionary efforts.
Were they successful in getting any rights?
Unfortunately, no. After the revolutions were suppressed, most women's organizations were shut down, and even progressive male leaders didn't prioritize women's rights. Still, the revolutions helped plant the seeds for future feminist movements in the later 19th century.
And symbolically, their participation mattered. It challenged the idea that politics was only for men, and proved that women were just as engaged in the fight for liberty and justice.
That's powerful. Even if the revolutions failed, the ideas didn't die.
Exactly. These women proved that history isn't just shaped by generals and kings. It's also shaped by voices that don't always make it into the headlines.
And it seems like each of these ideologies really spoke to different groups. Conservatism appealed most to the old nobility who wanted to preserve their privileges. Liberalism attracted the new middle-class bourgeoisie, business owners, lawyers, professionals who wanted political voice and economic freedom. And socialism resonated with the working class, who faced the harshest conditions and felt excluded from both wealth and power.
That's a sharp observation, Casey. Class wasn't the only factor driving ideology, but it played a huge role. Social position shaped people's priorities, whether they wanted to protect what they had or fight for what they lacked.
And that's part of why the revolutions of 1848 were so fragile. These different groups might agree on opposing the old order, but they didn't always agree on what should replace it. When push came to shove, the alliances fell apart, and the ruling elites took advantage of that division.
Thanks for listening to episode 27. In our next episode, we'll be exploring the emotional, imaginative world of Romanticism and how art and literature responded to all this change. Until then, you can check out our music projects on Spotify, YouTube Music, and Apple Music. Stay curious, think critically,